In Redwood State Penitentiary, a black inmate was about to challenge the unshakable rule of Sergeant Raymond "Red" Keller, the white guard who ran D-Block like his personal kingdom. What started as a fabricated contraband charge spiraled when Keller orchestrated a brutal welcome for Marcus Holloway, ensuring the activist-turned-prisoner understood exactly who held the power. Marcus Holloway wasn't your typical inmate. For years, he had endured police brutality, wrongful imprisonment, and the slow grind of a legal system designed to break men like him. Known for his unwavering resolve and strategic mind, Marcus had never been one to back down from injustice. When Keller had Marcus thrown into solitary under false charges, he had no idea he was messing with a man who had spent his life dismantling systems of oppression from the inside. Marcus waited, listened, and learned, laying the foundation for something far greater than mere survival. What began as another show of brute force would become a reckoning unlike anything Redwood had seen before. The prison walls would tremble the day Sergeant Keller discovered that power built on fear can crumble in an instant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transport van rumbled down the winding road toward Redwood State Penitentiary, its tires crunching on gravel as dawn broke over the pine-covered hills. Marcus Holloway sat motionless, wrists and ankles shackled, watching shadows crawl across the valley floor. The prison materialized from the morning fog like a medieval fortress. Concrete walls, razor wire, guard towers silhouetted against the pale sky. "Home sweet home," the transport guard sneered, catching Marcus's eye in the rearview mirror. "You'll die here, Saint." Marcus didn't respond. The nickname had followed him inside, a remnant from his civil rights activism days. Now it was spoken, with mockery, but Marcus had stopped caring what others called him long ago. The van jerked to a halt at the main gate. Heavy doors slid open with mechanical precision, the grinding sound of steel on steel, a fitting welcome. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Somewhere in this fortress was the evidence that would prove his innocence, the truth about the frame job that had sent him away for life. But first, he had to survive. Cell Block D was a concrete purgatory, stinking of industrial cleaner and desperation. Marcus stood at attention as Sergeant Raymond "Red" Keller circled him, a predator sizing up fresh meat. Keller was tall and lean, with close-cropped ginger hair and cold blue eyes that never seemed to blink. A thin scar traced his jawline like a signature. "Well, well," Keller drawled, flipping through Marcus's file. "Marcus St. Holloway, civil rights leader, community organizer, murderer." He spat the last word. "Alleged," Marcus said quietly. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Inmates in the common area froze, eyes wide. No one corrected Keller. Keller's smile was a knife slash across his face. "Your alleged days are over, Holloway. Jury said you did it, judge said you did it, so you did it." He stepped closer, his breath hot against Marcus's face. "In here, I'm judge, jury, and if necessary, executioner, you understand?" Marcus met his gaze. "I understand how power works, Sergeant." Something flickered in Keller's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at not seeing fear. He recovered quickly, snapping. Marcus's file shut. "Jameson, Cooper, show our new guest to his accommodations." Keller nodded to two guards, both white, both built like slaughterhouse workers. "And give him the Redwood welcome." The Redwood welcome came swiftly. Marcus's meager possessions were scattered across the cell floor, his mattress slashed open, his toiletries crushed underfoot. The guards worked methodically, performing a choreographed routine they'd done countless times before. "Well, what do we have here?" Cooper said, producing a small plastic bag from inside Marcus's pillowcase. He held it up for all to see, white powder wrapped in clear plastic. Marcus didn't bother protesting. The frame was obvious, the script predictable. "Contraband on your first day," Jameson clicked his tongue. "Sergeant Keller's gonna have to put that in your permanent record." From the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed a young guard watching from the corridor. Unlike the others, his uniform seemed freshly pressed, his face unweathered. Their eyes met briefly, and Marcus caught something there. discomfort, maybe even shame, before the young guard looked away. "Get him to the box," Cooper ordered. 3 days to think about how to behave at Redwood. The isolation cell was 8 by 10 feet of bare concrete with a metal toilet, a thin mattress on the floor, and a light bulb that never turned off. Marcus sat cross-legged on the mattress, eyes closed, breathing evenly. He'd spent enough time in jail cells during protests to know how to handle confinement. When the slot in the door scraped open on the second day, Marcus didn't move. "Holloway, food." Marcus opened his eyes to see the young guard from before sliding a tray through the slot. "Thank you, officer." "Grayson," the guard replied after a moment's hesitation. "Thomas Grayson." Marcus nodded. "Thank you, Officer Grayson." Grayson lingered, seemingly uncertain. "You should know," he said finally, voice low. "Keller runs this place, especially D Block. The warden lets him do whatever he wants as long as things stay quiet." "And do things stay quiet?" Grayson's laugh was brittle. "Depends who you ask. White inmates, sure. Black inmates," he trailed off. "I understand," Marcus said. "No, you don't," Grayson replied, an unexpected edge in his voice. "You came in with a reputation, Holloway. Keller doesn't like that. He's going to break you." "Many have tried." Grayson shook his head. "Not like him, just keep your head down. Play along. That's how you survive Redwood." After Grayson left, Marcus examined his food tray. A soup bowl with a folded scrap of paper underneath. He unfolded it carefully. A crude map of cell block D, with X's marking blind spots in the surveillance. "System." No signature, but the message was clear. Someone was watching, and not everyone was Keller's puppet. The general population greeted Marcus with wary curiosity when he returned from isolation. The racial divide was immediately apparent. White inmates occupied the best tables in the common area, the best jobs in the work programs, the cleanest section of the cells. Black inmates moved in tight groups for protection, eyes constantly scanning for threats. "New fish." The voice came from behind Marcus as he stood in the lunch line. He turned to find himself facing a mountain of a man, 6'6" at least, with forearms thick as tree trunks and a face marked by old scars. Around his neck hung a crude medallion fashioned from commissary items. "Big Ray Jefferson," the man introduced himself. "You the saint I've been hearing about?" Marcus nodded once. "Marcus Holloway." Big Ray studied him, unimpressed. "Word is you went toe-to-toe with Keller and didn't blink. That true?" "I didn't see a reason to blink." Several inmates nearby snickered, but Big Ray silenced them with a glare. "Let me tell you how things work here, Saint. Keller runs the guards. I run our side of the yard. You got a problem? You come to me. Not the white shirts. You need protection. It comes through me. You want extra food, better work detail, anything, it comes through me." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But first, you gotta earn your place." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "I'm not looking for trouble, Ray." "Nah? Then what are you looking for?" "Justice." Big Ray's laugh boomed across the cafeteria, drawing stares. "Justice? Man, you in Redwood now. Ain't no justice here, just us." His expression hardened. "Keller's been running this joint for 8 years. White boys get the good jobs, the clean cells, the extra privileges, we get the scraps, that's how it is." "Why do you accept it?" Big Ray leaned closer. "You think we haven't fought back? Keller breaks anyone who stands up, makes examples of them." He pulled up his sleeve, revealing a twisted scar running from wrist to elbow. 3 years ago, we tried organizing a hunger strike. This is how Keller responded. Said I fell in the shower room. Marcus examined the scar. "So instead, you became his business partner." Big Ray's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Watch yourself, Saint. You don't know a damn thing about surviving in here. I know there are other ways to fight besides violence." "Yeah? Your other ways got you a life sentence, didn't they?" Big Ray shook his head. "Keller's gonna come. For you again. When he does, you better be ready to kneel or swing. There's no third option." As Big Ray walked away, Marcus noticed skinny Lyle Perkins watching from the white inmates section, rail-thin with blonde hair cropped to the scalp, Nazi tattoos covering his neck and hands. Skinny Lyle was Keller's eyes and ears among the inmates. He caught Marcus looking and drew a finger across his throat, grinning. That night, lying on his thin mattress listening to the symphony of prison sounds, coughs, whispers, occasional sobs, Marcus began to formulate his plan. Keller's power rested on three pillars: the warden's indifference, the white inmate's loyalty, and the black inmate's fear. Remove anyone, and the structure would begin to crumble. Violence wouldn't work. That was Keller's domain, his native language. Information, however, that was a different kind of weapon. In his previous life, Marcus had learned that systems of oppression survived on secrecy, exposed their inner workings, and even the strongest began to crack. 3 cells down, someone began screaming, the raw, desperate sound of a man being broken. Guards' boots thundered down the corridor, batons struck flesh. The screaming stopped. Marcus closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing. Patience had always been his strength. He would watch, learn, wait for Keller to reveal his vulnerabilities. And then, piece by piece, he would dismantle the kingdom Keller had built. 3 weeks into his sentence at Redwood, Marcus had established a routine. He spent mornings in the laundry detail, one of the worst jobs in the prison reserved for those out of favor, scalding his hands in industrial washers filled with bleach and ammonia. Afternoons were for the yard, where he walked the perimeter alone, counting steps, memorizing guard rotations. Evenings were for the library, where few inmates ventured, preferring the numbing comfort of television. It was in the library that he first noticed Walter Briggs, hunched over a desk piled with law books. Briggs was ancient by prison standards, 75, at least with paper-thin skin and arthritic hands. The old man had been at Redwood for 27 years, serving life for a murder he might or might not have committed. What mattered to Marcus was that Briggs had outlasted 3 wardens and dozens of guards, including Keller. "Mind if I join you?" Marcus asked, approaching Briggs's table with a carefully selected book on prison reform. Briggs glanced up, roomy, eyes narrowing. "Free country." His laugh was a dry rattle. "Well, not in here, but you take my meaning." Marcus sat, opening his book. They read in silence for nearly an hour before Briggs spoke again. "You're that civil rights fellow, the saint." "Some call me that." "Heard you stood up to Keller. Not many do that and keep all their teeth." Marcus closed his book. "I'm still learning how things work here." Briggs tapped a yellowed fingernail against his legal pad. "You want to know how things work? Follow the money. Even in here, everything comes down to money." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "How do you mean?" Briggs's smile revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "Keller runs more than just D-Block, son. He runs a business." The library became their meeting place. Each evening, Briggs shared another piece of the puzzle: how Keller managed shipments of contraband through the laundry service, which guards were on his payroll, which weren't. Most valuable were the names Briggs provided: judges, police officers, even a state representative who benefited from Keller's operation. "How do you know all this?" Marcus asked after a particularly detailed description of Keller's arrangement. "With the food supplier." Briggs tapped his ear. "People forget old men can hear. Been watching Keller build his little empire for years." He leaned closer. "But the real question is, what are you planning to do with what I'm telling you?" Marcus considered the question. "Someone once told me that systems of injustice rely on secrecy. Expose them to light, they start to wither." "That someone ever been to prison?" "Not until now." Briggs snorted. "Light's in short supply here, son." "Then we'll have to make our own." Marcus lowered his voice. "You still have that contact in the public defender's office? The one who helped with your last appeal?" Briggs studied him carefully. "Jamie Parks, she's a good kid. Naive, but her heart's in the right place." "And she still visits you?" "First Tuesday of every month. Why?" Marcus smiled. I think Ms. Parks might be interested in some information about how Redwood is being run. The first tremor hit on a Wednesday morning. Marcus was elbow-deep in laundry when Officer Cooper stormed into the facility, face flushed with anger. "Everyone out now," he barked, sending inmates scrambling. Through the small window in the laundry room door, Marcus watched as Cooper tore the place apart, upending hampers, slashing open bags of clean linens, dismantling the large industrial dryers. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. At lunch, the rumor mill was churning. "Internal Affairs showed up this morning," whispered Darnell, a young inmate who worked in the administrative offices. "Something about contraband coming through, the laundry service." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Any idea what kind of contraband?" "Pills, mostly. Oxy, Percocet. The kind of stuff white boys in D-Block always seem to have plenty of." Marcus nodded, taking a bite of his flavorless mashed potatoes. Across the cafeteria, he noticed Skinny Lyle huddled with his Aryan Brotherhood soldiers, their expressions tense. More tellingly, there was no sign of Keller. The sergeant's absence extended through the afternoon. When he finally appeared for evening count, the change was visible. Keller's usual swagger had hardened into something brittle, his eyes darting suspiciously across the faces of inmates and guards alike. "Holloway," he barked as Marcus passed. "A word." Keller led him to an empty corridor, shoving him against the wall as soon as they were out of sight of the other guards. "You been asking questions about my business, Holloway?" Marcus kept his face blank. "I don't know what you're talking about, Sergeant." Keller's fist connected with Marcus's stomach, driving the air from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping. "Don't play dumb with me. I know you've been spending time with Old Man Briggs. I know you've been asking about shipments, about who gets what." He grabbed Marcus's chin, forcing his head up. "Internal Affairs just spent 6 hours tearing my operation apart because someone tipped them off about the laundry service. Now who do you think that someone might be?" Marcus straightened slowly, fighting for breath. "With respect, Sergeant, if I wanted to cause trouble, why would I target the one place where I work every day? That would just make me the obvious suspect." Doubt flickered across Keller's face. "You think you're smart, don't you? St. Holloway always 3 moves ahead." "I'm just trying to survive my sentence." Keller's grip tightened. "You'll survive. As long as I let you survive, remember that." He released Marcus with a shove. "I've got my eye on you. One wrong move and you'll wish you were back in isolation." As Keller stalked away, Marcus allowed himself a small private smile. The first seed had been planted. The ripples spread quickly through Redwood's ecosystem. Warden Dunbar, unwilling to risk the scandal of a full investigation, quietly ordered Keller to shut down the laundry operation. The sudden drought of prescription pills sent the white inmates into withdrawal-fueled paranoia. More significant was the change in Keller himself. Where before he had ruled with calculated precision, now his methods grew erratic. He lashed out at the slightest provocation, even against his own men. He nearly broke Johnson's jaw yesterday, Officer Grayson confided during a rare private moment as he escorted Marcus back from the library. Johnson's been with him for 3 years, loyal as they come, and Keller accused him of tipping off Internal Affairs. "Were they close?" Marcus asked, careful to keep his tone merely conversational. "Close as anyone is to Keller. Johnson used to handle the exchanges with the delivery drivers." Grayson paused, lowering his voice further. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but Keller's coming apart. And when he snaps, a lot of people are going to get hurt." "Why do you stay?" Marcus asked. "I've seen you watching. You don't agree with how he runs things." Grayson's laugh was hollow. "Where would I go? My dad was a guard. His dad was a guard. This is what we do. Besides, not all of us have the luxury of standing on principle." "Principles aren't a luxury, Officer Grayson. They're a necessity, especially in places like this." Grayson gave him a long look. "You sound like you're still giving speeches, Holloway, but this isn't a rally. This is Redwood. Different rules apply." "Rules can be changed. Not by one man." Marcus smiled faintly. "Then it's a good thing I'm not alone." In the yard the next day, Big Ray approached Marcus as he completed his solitary lap around the perimeter. "Been watching you, Saint," Ray said, falling into step beside him. "You've been busy for a man who keeps to himself. Just serving my time." "Nah, I don't think so." Ray's voice dropped. "Word is you're the reason the white boy's pill supply dried up, that you somehow got to internal affairs." Marcus maintained his pace. "And if that were true, then I'd say you've got bigger balls than I gave you credit for." Ray studied him with new interest. "But I'd also say you're playing a dangerous game. Keller doesn't lose gracefully." "I'm not trying to beat Keller at his own game. I'm changing the game." "How's that working out for you?" "Look around." Marcus nodded toward the Aryan Brotherhood where Skinny Lyle was berating one of his soldiers. "They're turning on each other. Keller's questioning his own men. Fear only works when it's directed outward. When it turns inward, it becomes something else, paranoia." Big Ray was silent for several steps. "You're smarter than you look, Saint. But smart don't keep you alive in a place like this." "That's why I keep walking these laps," Marcus replied. "Always good to know where the exits are." The first direct confrontation came sooner than Marcus had anticipated. 3 days after the internal affairs visit, he returned to his cell after dinner to find Skinny Lyle waiting for him, flanked by 2 Aryan Brotherhood soldiers. "Been wanting to have a chat with you, Saint," Skinny drawled, toying with a homemade shiv. "About all these changes happening around here." Marcus stayed near the cell entrance. "Not sure what that has to do with me." "See, that's where we disagree." Skinny took a step forward. "You show up and suddenly our supply lines get hit. Our boys start getting extra scrutiny from the guards and Keller. He ain't himself lately, jumping at shadows, seeing spies everywhere. Sounds like a personal problem." Skinny's pale face flushed. "It's about to be your problem. Keller might not be sure you're behind all this, but I am, and I don't need his permission to solve the issue." Marcus measured the distance to the door, calculating his chances. If it came to violence, he'd be outnumbered and cornered. But he had expected. This moment had prepared for it. "Before you do something permanent, you might want to consider what happens next," Marcus said calmly. "I've arranged for certain information to be released if anything happens to me. Information about who really runs the drug trade in D Block. And it's not Keller. It's you using his protection while skimming profits off the top." Skinny's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "You're bluffing." "Am I? You've been holding back 20% of every shipment, selling it independently to the guards in C Block. Keller thinks the suppliers have been shorting him, but it's been you all along." It was a shot in the dark based on fragments Briggs had shared, but Marcus could see from Skinny's expression that he'd hit the mark. "Who told you that?" Skinny hissed. "Does it matter? What matters is who I've told. If I don't check in with certain people tonight, Keller gets the full accounting tomorrow morning." The cell was silent except for the heavy breathing of Skinny's enforcers. "You've made a mistake, Saint," Skinny said finally, sliding the shiv back into his sleeve. "A big one." "We all make mistakes, Lyle. The difference is learning from them." After they left, Marcus sat on his bunk, hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it confirmed something crucial. The unity among Keller's men was fracturing. Fear was giving way to suspicion. The first crack had appeared in Keller's armor. Now it was time to widen it. That night, Marcus met Briggs in their usual corner of the library. "Your information was good," Marcus told him. "Internal affairs hit the laundry operation exactly where it hurt." Briggs nodded almost imperceptibly. Jamie was excited. Said her supervisor nearly fell out of his chair when he saw the documentation. "What happens next?" "Nothing, probably." Briggs shrugged. "Warden Dunbar has friends in high places. The investigation will get buried just like all the others." "Then why bother?" "Because," Briggs said, leaning forward, "even a buried investigation leaves a paper trail. Each report, each affidavit, each piece of evidence, they add up. If Jamie keeps pushing, eventually the pile gets too big to ignore." Marcus nodded slowly. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, Keller's sweating. Look at him. He's pulling. his operation apart trying to find the leak, and the more he tightens his grip, the more his people slip through his fingers, Marcus finished. Briggs smiled his tobacco-stained smile. Now you're getting it, son. Later, as Officer Grayson escorted him back to his cell, Marcus noticed the young guard studying him with new interest. Something on your mind, officer? Grayson hesitated. Is it true what they're saying? That you're the one who tipped off internal affairs about the laundry operation? What do you think? I think, Grayson said carefully, that you're either the bravest man in this prison or the most foolish. Marcus smiled. Maybe a little of both. Around them, cell block D hummed with tension. White inmates eyeing each other with suspicion, black inmates watching the shift with wary anticipation, guards moving with heightened alertness. The balance of power was beginning to tilt. At Detail, the guard station, Keller stood watching, his cold eyes following Marcus's progress down the corridor. His expression promised retribution, but beneath the anger, Marcus detected something new: uncertainty. The game had only just begun. The yard buzzed with tension on a gray Tuesday afternoon, 2 months into Marcus's sentence. The usual segregation remained: white inmates claiming the weight pit and basketball court, black inmates relegated to the track and patchy grass field. But something had shifted. Conversations stopped when guards passed. Eyes tracked Keller's movements with new wariness. The contraband drought had stretched into its 3rd week, leaving the white inmates edgy and irritable. Marcus completed his daily laps, aware of Keller watching from the guard tower. The sergeant hadn't confronted him directly since their hallway encounter, but Marcus recognized the tactical retreat for what it was. Keller was gathering information, planning his counter-move. It came without warning. A shout erupted from the basketball court, followed by the sound of flesh hitting flesh. 2 inmates, one white, one black, were scuffling near the 3-point line. Within seconds, more joined the fray from both sides. The alarm blared. Guards rushed forward, batons raised. Marcus stepped back, keeping clear of the violence. He watched as Keller descended from the tower, moving with practiced efficiency toward the growing chaos. Their eyes met across the yard. Keller smiled. That's when Marcus understood this wasn't spontaneous, it was orchestrated. Holloway! Keller's voice cut through the din. Stand down now! Before Marcus could respond, 2 guards seized him from behind. A baton struck the back of his knees, driving him to the ground. His arms were wrenched behind his back, zip ties cutting into his wrists. We've got reports you instigated this, Keller said, standing over him. Multiple witnesses saw you pass a message to Jones before he attacked Miller. That's a lie, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the knee pressing between his shoulder. Blades. I haven't spoken to either of them. Keller crouched down, his voice dropping to a whisper. Who's going to believe you over me? I run this prison, remember? He straightened, addressing the other guards. Get him to isolation. I'll deal with him personally after we lock this place down. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The beating came that night. 4 guards, including Cooper and Jameson, but not Grayson. They worked methodically, avoiding his face, concentrating on his torso, his kidneys, his legs, places where damage wouldn't show to visitors. Keller supervised, occasionally offering suggestions on technique. You know what I admire about you, Holloway, Keller said conversationally, as Marcus gasped for breath on the cell floor. Your commitment. Most men would have learned their lesson by now. Marcus spat blood. And what lesson would that be? That some systems can't be changed. They can only be survived. Every system can be changed. Keller sighed, genuinely disappointed. All that education, and you still don't get it. This isn't about right and wrong. It's about reality. He nodded to Cooper. Again. The baton cracked against Marcus's ribs. Something gave way with an audible snap. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. This is reality, Holloway, Keller continued. Me, up here, he prodded Marcus with his boot. You, down there. That's not going to change no matter how many letters you write to Internal Affairs. Marcus forced his eyes open, meeting Keller's gaze. You're afraid. Keller's smile vanished. What did you say? A man, confident in his power, doesn't need to do this. Each word was an effort through the pain. You're losing control. And you know it. Keller's boot connected with Marcus's stomach, driving the remaining air from his lungs. 30 days in. Isolation, Keller announced. No visitors, no mail, no books. Nothing but you and these walls. He leaned closer. Let's see how your principles hold up when there's no one to witness your suffering. Time blurred in isolation. Days measured by meal deliveries, nights by the dimming of the overhead light. Marcus's body ached constantly, his fractured ribs protesting with each breath. In the darkness, he practiced mental exercises from his activist days, visualizing better worlds, reviewing texts he had memorized, reconstructing conversations. Anything to keep his mind from fraying. On what he guessed was the 5th day, the meal slot opened at an unusual hour. Instead of a tray, a small package wrapped in cloth appeared, followed by a whispered, "Hurry." Marcus unwrapped it quickly. Extra. Bread, a small jar of peanut butter, and most precious of all, ibuprofen tablets. A folded note accompanied the contraband. Not all of us are like him. The handwriting matched the map he'd received earlier. Officer Grayson. The kindness sustained him more than the food. It was evidence that Keller's authority wasn't absolute, that resistance was spreading beyond Marcus's direct influence. On the 12th day, the routine changed again. The door opened fully, revealing Warden Dunbar, a thin, gray-haired man Marcus had only glimpsed during his processing. "Mr. Holloway," Dunbar said, his voice precise and formal. "I understand you've been having a difficult adjustment to Redwood." Marcus struggled to sit up, wincing as his ribs protested. "I'd call it an education, Warden." Dunbar's mouth tightened. "Sergeant Keller tells me you instigated the yard incident." "Sergeant Keller is mistaken. 7 witnesses say otherwise. 7 witnesses who answer to Keller." Dunbar studied him without expression. "You have a history of civil disobedience, of challenging authority. I have a history of seeking justice." "Justice." Dunbar repeated the word as if tasting something unpleasant. "Let me be clear, Mr. Holloway. Redwood State operates on a delicate balance. Sergeant Keller maintains that balance. If you continue disrupting it, the consequences will be severe, for you and for others who might be inspired by your example." "Is that a threat, Warden?" "It's reality." Dunbar turned to leave, then paused. "I'm authorizing your return to General. Population tomorrow. Consider it a gesture of good faith. Don't make me regret it." After Dunbar left, Marcus lowered himself carefully back onto the thin mattress. The warden's visit confirmed what he'd suspected. Keller had been forced to justify his actions to his superior. The power dynamic was shifting, however, slightly. Marcus's return to D Block was met with whispers and sidelong glances. He moved gingerly, his body still healing from Keller's lesson, but he kept his expression neutral, his back straight. Showing weakness would undo everything he'd accomplished. Big Ray intercepted him in the corridor outside the mess hall. "Damn, Saint," Ray said, eyeing Marcus's careful movements. "Thought you might be coming back in a body bag." "Keller doesn't want me dead. Dead men can't suffer." Ray's expression was unreadable. "Word is you took his beating without begging. That's earned you some respect, even from guys who thought you were soft. I didn't do it for respect." "No?" Ray raised an eyebrow. "Then what was it for?" "To show that his methods don't work. Pain is temporary. Fear only controls you if you let it." Ray shook his head, but there was something new in his eyes, a calculating interest. "You still going on about changing the system, after what they did to you? Especially after what they did to me." Marcus met his gaze steadily. The harder Keller pushes, the clearer it becomes that he's losing his grip. He wouldn't have needed the yard incident if he was still in control. You're either the craziest motherfucker I've ever met, or the smartest, Ray said finally. Come see me tomorrow. We should talk. Later, in the shower block, Marcus discovered someone had left a small jar of salve on the bench beside his towel, a home remedy for bruising popular among the older inmates. No note, but the message was clear. Eyes were watching, allies were emerging. Officer Grayson sought him out during evening recreation period, ostensibly checking his ID but leaning close to whisper, "Infirmary. 10 minutes. Say you're feeling dizzy from your medication." The infirmary was empty except for Nurse Abernathy, an older woman with steel-gray hair and perpetually pursed lips. She barely glanced up when Marcus entered. "Another one of Keller's special cases?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "Sit, I'll get the paperwork." She disappeared into a back office, leaving Marcus alone with Grayson. "I don't have long," Grayson said, his voice low and urgent. "Things are changing. Keller's been called to the warden's office 3 times since your beating. There's talk about an external investigation." "Into what?" "Everything. The contraband, the racial segregation, the selective enforcement." Grayson glanced nervously at the door. Someone sent a detailed report to the State Corrections Board. Dates, names, specific incidents going back years. Marcus kept his expression neutral. Briggs and his public defender contact had been busy. "Keller knows it was you," Grayson continued. "He can't prove it, but he knows. He's out for blood now. Why are you telling me this?" Grayson ran a hand through his hair. "Because I joined corrections to help rehabilitate people, not to torture them. What Keller's doing, what he's always done, it's wrong. But speaking up gets you labeled a snitch, gets you isolated, maybe worse. So you stay silent. Until now." Grayson met his eyes. "I want to help." "Why now?" "Because you were right, about principles, about changing things." He shook his head. "Or maybe I'm just tired of hating what I see in the mirror every morning." Before Marcus could respond, Nurse Abernathy returned with a clipboard. "You've got 2 minutes, she announced, fixing Grayson with a pointed stare. "Then my patient needs rest." That night, the consequences of Marcus's stand became clear. As he lay on his bunk, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate his injuries, 3 white inmates were dragged from their cells by Keller's guards. The sounds that followed, pleas, impacts, muffled cries, echoed through D Block. "Making examples," murmured his cellmate, Edwards, a quiet man serving 15 years for armed robbery. "Those are the ones suspected of talking to internal affairs." But something had changed. Instead of cowering in fearful silence, inmates began to bang on their cell doors, metal cups against metal bars creating a thunderous protest. The cacophony grew until Keller was forced to end the beatings earlier than planned. The message was unmistakable. Solidarity was forming across racial lines. The next morning, during breakfast, Big Ray slid onto the bench across from Marcus. "I've been watching you," Ray said without preamble. "Thinking about what you're trying to do." Marcus waited. "I didn't believe it at first. Taking down Keller?" Ray shook his head. "Not possible. But now, maybe." He leaned forward. "My boys are getting tired of being second class in here. Your approach, using their rules against them, it's working." "It's not just my approach," Marcus replied. "It's everyone who's ever stood up, everyone who's passed information, everyone who refused to be broken." Ray nodded slowly. "Well, you've got my attention now. What's your next move?" Before Marcus could answer, the mess hall doors burst open. Keller strode in, flanked by Cooper and Jameson, heading directly for their table. "Holloway," Keller barked. "On your feet." Marcus rose slowly, mindful of his healing ribs. "You just can't help yourself, can you?" Keller's voice carried across the suddenly quiet room. "Back one day, already stirring up trouble." "I'm just having breakfast, Sergeant." "With the leader of the black gang. Planning something?" "Discussing literature," Marcus replied evenly. "I recommended letter from Birmingham jail. Jefferson thinks Baldwin is more relevant to our current situation." Suppressed laughter rippled through the mess hall. Keller's face flushed. "You think you're untouchable now because the warden's watching?" Because some bureaucrats are asking questions? Keller stepped closer. This is still my prison, and I've broken better men than you. No, Marcus said quietly. You haven't. For a moment it seemed Keller might strike him then and there. Instead he smiled, a cold, calculated expression that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. We'll see, Keller said, turning to leave. We'll see. As Keller walked away, Marcus caught Big Ray's eye. The gang leader nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture of respect, of nascent alliance. The battle lines were being redrawn. A week after his return from solitary, Marcus sat in the library with Walter Briggs, speaking in hushed tones while pretending to review legal documents. Keller's power comes from unity, Marcus explained. White guards, white inmates, all believing they benefit from his system. He tapped the table thoughtfully. But what if they discovered they weren't all benefiting equally? Briggs raised an eyebrow. Divide and conquer? Something like that. Marcus slid a folded paper across the table. This is a list of white inmates in D Block who've received favorable treatment from Keller. Better jobs, extra commissary, protection. And this, he passed another sheet, is a list of those who haven't, despite their loyalty. Briggs examined the lists. Where'd you get this information? Officer Grayson has been helpful. So have the trustees who work in administration. Marcus leaned forward. The Aryan Brotherhood isn't a monolith. There are fractures, old-timers who resent Skinny Lyle's control, newcomers who feel they're doing all the dirty work with none of the rewards. And you plan to widen those fractures? I plan to illuminate them. Marcus smiled thinly. Let them see the truth for themselves. The canteen was crowded that afternoon. Inmates lined up for their weekly commissary purchases. Marcus stood beside Donovan, a white inmate serving 10 years for armed robbery, watching as Skinny Lyle and his inner circle moved to the front of the line. That's the third time this month they've cut, Donovan muttered. Guard doesn't say a word. Privilege of being Keller's favorite, Marcus replied casually. Must be nice. We're all supposed to be on the same side, Donovan said, frustration evident in his voice. That what they tell you? Interesting. Marcus kept his tone neutral. Did you know Lyle's crew gets double commissary? Keller signs off on it personally. Donovan's head snapped toward him. Bullshit. Check the logs. My buddy in administration saw the paperwork. Lyle's people get double tobacco rations, extra food. Meanwhile, the rest of you get standard issue. Why would Keller play favorites like that? Marcus shrugged. Maybe not all white inmates are created equal in his eyes. Some are useful, some are just background. He walked away, leaving Donovan staring at Lyle with new suspicion. The work detail provided the next opportunity. Marcus had been assigned to maintenance, a marginally better position than laundry, but still reserved for disfavored inmates. His partner was Mitchell, a taciturn white man serving 20 years for manslaughter. As they repaired a section of fence near the administrative building, Marcus mentioned casually, Heard you were with the Brotherhood when you first got here. Mitchell stiffened. That was a long time ago. What happened? A long silence followed as Mitchell twisted wire into place. Lyle happened, he finally said. Used to be, Brotherhood looked out for all white inmates. Now it's just Lyle's crew, getting the perks, the rest of us doing their dirty work. Must be frustrating, Marcus ventured. Being expected to maintain racial solidarity when the benefits only flow one way. Mitchell studied him suspiciously. Why do you care? I don't. Just making conversation. Well, don't, Mitchell snapped. But the seed had been planted. That evening, Big Ray summoned Marcus to his cell during recreation hour. Ray's status afforded him certain privileges, including a single cell stocked with more comforts than regulations permitted, evidence of his own arrangements with the guards, though not with Keller directly. Your stock is rising, Saint, Ray said without preamble. Got guys asking about you, wanting to know where you stand. And what do you tell them? That I'm still figuring you out. Ray gestured for Marcus to sit. I've been watching what you're doing with the whites. Clever, but dangerous. Most worthwhile things are. Ray leaned forward. What's your endgame here? Say you manage to turn Keller's own people against him. What happens next? Another white guard takes his place, nothing changes. Unless the system itself changes. Marcus held Ray's gaze. What if D Block wasn't divided by race anymore? What if assignments, privileges, protections were equal? Ray laughed. Now I know you're dreaming. Am I? The corrections board is already investigating. Warden Dunbar is worried. He's vulnerable. If the white power structure fractures, there's an opportunity to rebuild something different. And you think they'd let someone like me have a say? I think someone like you would take a say. Marcus smiled. But it has to start with breaking Keller's hold. And for that, I need your help. Ray studied him for a long moment. What exactly are you proposing? An alliance. Your influence with the black inmates, my strategy. United, we could... I didn't survive 15 years in here. By joining Crusade Saint. No, you survived by adapting to an unjust system, Marcus countered. I'm offering you a chance to help reshape it. Think about it. Equal work assignments, equal commissary, equal protection. Your men wouldn't have to live as second-class inmates anymore. Ray was silent, considering. I'll think about it, he said finally. But I need something concrete, a sign that your way actually works. Fair enough, Marcus said. Watch what happens next. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Keller instituted a new search protocol in D Block, supposedly random but heavily weighted toward black inmates' cells. When Marcus's cell was searched, Officer Grayson was assigned to the detail. Under the mattress, Grayson murmured too quietly for the other guard to hear. Tonight, move fast. That night, after lights out, Marcus felt beneath his mattress and found a folded piece of paper, an internal memo from Keller to the warden detailing which guards received kickbacks from the contraband operation. Most were white guards loyal to Keller, but conspicuously absent was Officer Jameson, Keller's most visible enforcer. The next day, Marcus passed Jameson's name to a white inmate known for his loose lips, with a simple question. Why isn't Jameson getting a cut when he does most of Keller's dirty work? By lunchtime, the question had reached Jameson himself. The confrontation occurred during evening count. Jameson approached Keller in the guard station, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet cell block. We need to talk about the payment schedule, Jameson said, an edge to his voice. Keller's response was cold. This isn't the time or place, officer. When is the time? Jameson demanded. 3 years I've been doing your heavy lifting. 3 years taking the risks. Now I hear everyone's getting a percentage except me? Keller's face flushed. Lower your voice, that's an order. An order? Jameson laughed bitterly. That's rich. We're partners, remember? Or at least that's what you said when you needed someone to handle the dirty work with Holloway. The mention of his name drew Marcus to the front of his cell. Across the block, he saw other inmates doing the same, witnessing the unprecedented spectacle of Keller's authority being challenged publicly by one of his own. You're suspended, Keller snapped. Report to the warden's office. Now. Suspending me won't make this go away, Jameson retorted. You think the others don't talk? You think they don't know you're playing favorites with the payouts? As Jameson stormed out, the cell block erupted in a low murmur. Keller's gaze swept the rows of cells lingering on Marcus. His expression promised retribution. But the damage was done. Guards were looking at each other with new suspicion. White inmates were whispering, comparing notes on who received what favors. The monolith was cracking. The next morning, Marcus found Skinny Lyle waiting for him in the shower block alone, a calculated risk on Lyle's part. I know what you're doing, Lyle said without preamble, turning whites against whites. Very smart. Marcus continued undressing, outwardly calm despite the potential danger. Is that what I'm doing, or am I just asking questions that were already there? Jameson's been reassigned to C Block. Cooper's under investigation. Keller's losing his protection. Sounds like a system correcting itself. Lyle stepped closer. Here's what you don't understand, Saint. Keller might fall, but I won't. The Brotherhood existed before him and it'll exist after him. Then why do you seem worried? Lyle's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm not worried. I'm planning. He turned to leave, then paused. Keller made the mistake of thinking he was irreplaceable. I don't make that mistake. Remember that. As Lyle left, Marcus understood the message. The power vacuum might be filled in ways he hadn't anticipated. Officer Grayson found Marcus in the library that afternoon, ostensibly checking the shelves but stopping to whisper, "Something's happening. Keller's been called to the warden's office 3 times today. Rumor is state investigators are coming next week." What triggered it? Anonymous package sent to the corrections board. Detailed records of Keller's operation. Names. Dates, amounts. Too specific to ignore. Grayson glanced around nervously. Keller's blaming you, of course. Let him. You don't understand. He's desperate now. A desperate man is unpredictable. So is a desperate system, Marcus replied. The old order is dying, Grayson. The question is, what will replace it? That night, Big Ray invited Marcus to join his table for dinner. A public declaration that Marcus was under his protection. The move sent ripples through the mess hall. Black inmates watched with curious respect, white inmates with uncertainty. You've made your point, Ray said as Marcus sat. Keller's losing his grip. Now tell me why I should risk aligning with you. Marcus nodded toward the white section of the cafeteria, where small groups were huddled in intense conversation, fragmented, rather than unified. Because change is coming whether we guide it or not. Skinny Lyle is positioning himself to take over if Keller falls. He'd be worse, younger, more violent, no pretense of institutional authority. That's your pitch? Help. You or things get worse. Help me and we both get what we want, Marcus corrected. You want better conditions for your men. I want a more just system. Those goals align. Ray considered this. What exactly would this alliance involve? Information sharing, coordinated, resistance to unfair policies, a united front when dealing with the administration. And after Keller, when the dust settles, we negotiate a new order, one that benefits everyone, not just those with the right skin color or connections. Ray studied him for a long moment. You actually believe this can work? I know it can, but not alone. Finally, Ray nodded. All right, Saint. You've got your alliance, but it's provisional. First sign this is going south, my guys protect our own. Fair enough. As they shook hands across the table, Marcus caught sight of Keller watching from the guard station, his expression thunderous. Beside him stood Warden Dunbar, observing, the unprecedented interracial alliance with naked alarm. The next morning, the rules changed. New guard rotations, new cell assignments, new work details, all designed to separate Marcus from potential allies. Black and white inmates who had been seen speaking together were split up, assigned to different schedules. They're scrambling, Briggs observed during their increasingly brief library sessions, trying to reassert control. Too late, Marcus replied. The cracks are too wide now. Indeed, the very attempt to separate inmates by race only highlighted the inequities of the previous system. White inmates who had never questioned their privileged position now found themselves subject to the same arbitrary restrictions that black inmates had endured for years. In the yard that afternoon, Marcus noticed several white inmates nodding respectfully as he passed. A small gesture, but unthinkable just weeks earlier. Skinny Lyle noticed too. As Marcus completed his daily laps, Lyle intercepted him near the weight pit. Your little social experiment is messing with the natural order, Lyle said, flanked by 2 of his soldiers. Natural order? Marcus raised an eyebrow. There's nothing natural about a system that values some lives over others based on skin color. That's where you're wrong, Saint. It's the most natural thing in the world. Lyle stepped closer. But I respect your game. You're smart. Smarter than Keller, that's for sure. Which is why I'm giving you a choice. I'm listening. Keller's finished. We both know it. When he falls, there's going to be a reshuffling. I could use someone with your strategic thinking. Marcus couldn't hide his surprise. You're offering me a place in your new order? I'm being practical. The Brotherhood adapts. Always has. And if I decline? Lyle's smile was cold. Then pray the state investigators get here before I decide you're too much trouble to keep around. As Lyle walked away, Marcus realized the game had become more complex than he'd anticipated. Breaking Keller's hold was only the beginning. What would fill the vacuum might be even more dangerous. That night, as Marcus lay on his bunk, contemplating his next move, a note slid under his cell door. 2 words in Grayson's handwriting. Tomorrow. Noon. The reckoning was at hand. Noon arrived with the harsh buzz of the lunch bell. Marcus made his way to the cafeteria, every sense alert for whatever Grayson's note had portended. The officer was nowhere to be seen, but tension hung in the air like smoke before a fire. Keller stood at the guard station overlooking the mess. Hall, his posture rigid, eyes constantly scanning the room. Beside him was Cooper, hand resting too casually on his baton. Something was coming. Marcus collected his tray and headed toward Big Ray's table, now his usual spot, a public declaration of their alliance that continued to draw stares. He was halfway there when the commotion started. Donovan, the white inmate who had complained about Skinny Lyle's privileges, was pulled roughly from the lunch line by 2 guards Marcus didn't recognize. "What the hell?" Donovan protested as they dragged him toward the center of the room. "I didn't do anything." Keller descended from the guard station, his movements deliberate, theatrical. The cafeteria fell silent. "Donovan Clark," Keller announced, his voice carrying to every corner, "found in possession of contraband intended for distribution, a serious offense." "That's bullshit." Donovan struggled against the guard's grip. "You know damn well I wasn't." The first blow came without warning, Cooper's baton connecting with Donovan's kidney. The inmate crumpled, gasping. Cooper continued methodically, targeting ribs, legs, back, all while Keller watched impassively. Marcus scanned the room. White inmates shifted uncomfortably, eyes downcast. Black inmates watched with grim recognition. They had seen this script played out countless times against their own. "This is what happens," Keller declared to the silent room, "when the natural order is disrupted, when people forget their place, when loyalty is replaced with questions." His gaze swept the room, lingering on Marcus before returning to Donovan's. Broken form. "Take him to medical, then solitary," Keller ordered. 30 days. As they dragged Donovan away, leaving smears of blood on the linoleum, Keller addressed the room once more. "Let that be a lesson to anyone thinking of stepping out of line. No one is exempt. No one." Instead of the fearful silence that would have followed such a display months earlier, a low murmur spread through the cafeteria. White inmates exchanged glances, their expressions troubled. The message Keller had intended, fear, had been overshadowed by something else. Betrayal. Donovan was one of them. He had been loyal, and Keller had sacrificed him. "He's desperate," Big Ray observed later as they sat in the yard, "using the old playbook when the game has changed." Marcus nodded. "He's showing them they're expendable. That whiteness alone doesn't protect them. A dangerous lesson to teach your own people." Around them, the yard's usual racial segregation was less defined. Small groups of white inmates stood apart from Skinny Lyle's crew, their expressions wary. Several nodded respectfully as Ray's lieutenants passed. "The state investigators arrive tomorrow," Marcus said quietly. "Keller's running out of time." Ray studied him. "You seem pretty confident they'll find something." "They already have. The question is whether they'll act on it. And if they don't?" Marcus gestured subtly toward the white inmates now distancing themselves from Lyle. "Then we already have our plan B." Marcus was returning from the shower block when Officer Grayson intercepted him, guiding him into an empty storage closet with a quick glance over his shoulder. "Sorry about the note," Grayson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Had to change plans. Keller's watching my every move." "What's happening?" The investigations hit a snag. Warden Dunbar's calling in favors to limit their scope, protect himself. Marcus absorbed this. And Keller? He's planning something. Grayson ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit. After what happened with Donovan, he's different, erratic, talking about making examples, restoring order. And you think I'm his next target. I know you are. He's convinced you're the source of all his problems. Grayson pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. I managed to copy some files from his office computer, financial records, guard assignments, incident reports, all doctored to cover up what's really happening in D Block. Marcus stared at the drive. Why are you giving me this? Because someone has to stop him. Grayson's expression hardened. I joined corrections because I thought I could make a difference. Instead, I've spent 2 years enabling a monster. This is a big step, Grayson. There's no going back. I know. He pressed the drive into Marcus's hand. There's a lawyer listed in there, Jamie Parks. She's been helping that old man Briggs. Get this to her. How? Visitor's Day. Tomorrow. I put you on the list myself. A noise in the corridor startled them both. Grayson cracked the door, peered out, then turned back to Marcus. One more thing, he said. Whatever happens, don't let Keller isolate you again. He won't be satisfied with just beating you this time. He wants me dead. He needs you dead. You've become a symbol now, and symbols are dangerous. That night, the prison hummed with an electric tension. Extra guards patrolled the corridors of D Block. Skinny Lyle and his inner circle were nowhere to be seen at dinner, sequestered elsewhere on Keller's orders, presumably. In the recreation room, Marcus found himself approached by Mitchell, the white inmate from his maintenance detail who had once been in the Brotherhood. Need to talk to you, Mitchell muttered, pretending to browse the bookshelf beside Marcus. Donovan wasn't random. He'd been talking to others, asking questions about Keller's favorites. Questions I planted, Marcus acknowledged. Yeah, well, it worked. Too well. Mitchell glanced around nervously. Word is Keller's got a list. Inmates he thinks are disloyal, spreading dissent. He's planning to make examples of all of them. When? Tonight, after final count. Mitchell met his eyes briefly. My name's on that list. So is yours. Right at the top. Marcus absorbed this. How many guards are with him? Cooper for sure. Maybe 2 others. The rest? Mitchell shrugged. They're keeping their distance. Nobody wants to be on a sinking ship. And Lyle? That's the thing, Mitchell said, his voice dropping further. Lyle's crew is split. Older guys are still with Keller. Younger ones are thinking it might be time for new leadership. Marcus nodded slowly. Thank you for the warning. Don't thank me. Mitchell's expression was grim. Just make sure when this whole thing blows up, people remember who stood where. As lights out approached, Marcus made his preparations. The USB drive was secure, wrapped in plastic and hidden in the one place guards rarely searched thoroughly. Inside the seam of his mattress, where the prison-issue fabric had been carefully sliced and resewn countless times by previous occupants. His cellmate Edwards watched silently as Marcus positioned himself on his bunk, angled to see anyone approaching the cell. Something's coming, Edwards observed quietly. Yes. They gonna try to take you out? Marcus glanced at him. Probably. Edwards nodded, reaching under his own mattress to produce a sharpened toothbrush handle, primitive but effective. Been saving this. Rather you have it than me. Marcus studied the makeshift weapon, then shook his head. That's not my way. It's suicide to face Keller empty-handed. I won't be empty-handed, Marcus replied. I'll have something more powerful than a shiv. Edwards snorted. What's that? The truth, and witnesses. Before Edwards could respond, the cell block plunged into darkness as the main lights shut down for the night. Only the dim emergency bulbs remained, casting long shadows across the concrete corridor. Marcus tensed, listening. For several minutes, there was only the usual symphony of prison night sounds, Coughing, murmured conversations, the occasional shout quickly silenced. Then, footsteps. Multiple sets approaching with purpose. "Holloway!" Keller's voice, low and dangerous in the semi-darkness, front and center. Marcus rose slowly from his bunk, moving to the cell door. Keller stood on the other side, flanked by Cooper and another guard. Behind them, at a slight distance, was Officer Grayson, his expression carefully blank. "Random cell inspection," Keller announced, loud enough for nearby inmates to hear. "Step back." As the cell door slid open, Marcus caught Grayson's eye. The young guard gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the end of the corridor, where shadows moved, inmates gathering, watching. Word had spread. "Nothing random about this," Marcus said calmly as Cooper moved toward him, baton raised. "Shut your mouth," Cooper growled, shoving him against the wall. "You've caused enough trouble." Keller stepped into the cell, his face half hidden in shadow. "You thought you were so clever, Holloway, turning my men against me, spreading lies, undermining everything I've built." "I didn't spread lies," Marcus replied, loud enough to carry to the gathering audience. "I just exposed the truth that you've been running this prison like your personal kingdom, profiting off of everyone, even the white inmates who thought you were protecting them." Cooper's baton slammed into Marcus's stomach, doubling him over. "I said shut it," Cooper hissed. But Marcus straightened, his voice stronger. "Ask yourself who's really been looking out for you," he called out, addressing the unseen witnesses in the darkness. Keller just beat Donovan half to death for asking. "Questions. Who's next? Mitchell, Reynolds? How many more examples does he need to make?" "That's enough," Keller snapped, nodding to Cooper. "Take him." Cooper grabbed Marcus's arm, but before he could move, a new voice spoke from the corridor. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Big Ray emerged from the shadows, flanked by 4 of his men. Behind them, more shapes materialized, white inmates, at least a dozen, standing shoulder to shoulder with Ray's crew. An unprecedented alliance. "This doesn't concern you, Jefferson," Keller said, his voice tight. "This is official business." "Looks like a lynching to me," Ray replied evenly. "And I think these gentlemen agree." He gestured to the white inmates, behind him. Marcus recognized Mitchell among them, along with others who had been distancing themselves from Skinny Lyle's crew. "You're interfering with a security operation," Keller said, his hand moving to his radio. "I'll have all of you, in solitary by morning." "Maybe," Ray shrugged. "Or maybe there won't be enough cells for all of us, and maybe the state investigators who arrive tomorrow will have some questions about why half the prison population is suddenly in isolation." Keller's face contorted with fury. "You think this changes anything? I run this prison. I decide who lives and who dies." "Not anymore," came another voice, Officer Grayson stepping forward. "Your operation's exposed, Sergeant. The warden's already distancing himself. By this time tomorrow, you'll be the one under investigation." For a moment, Keller seemed frozen, calculating his options. Then his expression shifted, a dangerous calm replacing the anger. "You've made your choice," he said, eyes moving from Grayson to Marcus to Ray. "All of you. Remember that when this falls apart." He turned to Cooper. "We're done here. For now." As Keller pushed past the gathered inmates, his authority visibly diminished. Marcus caught Ray's eye. The gang leader nodded once, acknowledgement of a battle won, but also recognition that the war was far from over. "It was a close thing," Grayson said later, having arranged to be the guard on night patrol for their section. "If Ray hadn't shown up when he did." "But he did," Marcus replied, "and now Keller knows he's lost control of D Block. Which makes him more dangerous, not less." Grayson leaned closer to the cell bars. "The USB drive, it's safe?" Marcus nodded. "Ready for tomorrow's visit?" "Good. Because after tonight, Keller will be looking for any way to neutralize you before that evidence gets out." Grayson's expression was grave. "You've started something here, Holloway. Something bigger than just taking down one corrupt guard." "That was always the point," Marcus replied. "Keller is a symptom. The system is the disease." As Grayson continued his rounds, Marcus sat on his bunk, contemplating the shifting landscape. The alliances formed tonight, black and white inmates standing together, a guard openly defying his superior, were unprecedented in Redwood's history. The boundaries that had defined prison life for decades were blurring. But as Mitchell had warned, when structures collapse, the falling debris can be deadly. Keller was cornered now, his empire crumbling. What would he do with nothing left to lose? The answer came just before dawn, as Marcus drifted in the light sleep of the perpetually vigilant. A scream echoed through D Block, followed by shouts, and the thunder of boots on concrete. Marcus was on his feet before his mind fully registered the commotion. Through the bars, he saw guards rushing toward the far end of the corridor. "What's happening?" Edwards asked, roused by the noise. Before Marcus could answer, Officer Grayson appeared at their cell, his face ashen. "It's Walter Briggs," he said, his voice hollow. "They found him in his cell. Someone cut his throat." The message couldn't have been clearer. Keller was done, playing by the rules, even his own. Walter Briggs's blood had barely dried when the lockdown came. All inmates confined to cells, meals delivered by guards in pairs. Visitation canceled, including Marcus's crucial meeting with Jamie Parks. The official story spread through whispered conversations between guards. Briggs had been killed in a racial conflict, evidence of growing tensions that required immediate containment. But no one believed it. Not the inmates who had witnessed the unprecedented unity the night before. Not the guards who had seen Keller's authority challenged openly. And certainly not Marcus, who understood exactly what Briggs's death represented. A desperate attempt to silence a key witness before the state investigators arrived. Marcus sat on his bunk, turning the USB drive over in his hands. The evidence it contained was useless if he couldn't get it out of Redwood. "They're saying you did it," Edwards mentioned casually from across the cell. "Killed the old man." Marcus looked up sharply. "Who's saying that?" "Cooper's been spreading it around. Says they found a shiv with your prints on it." "I've never touched a weapon in here." Edwards shrugged. "Truth doesn't matter much, does it? Not in a place like this." Before Marcus could respond, the cell block door crashed open. Keller strode in, flanked by 4 guards in riot gear, none of them familiar faces. No sign of Grayson. "Holloway," Keller barked. "On your feet. Hands through the slot." Marcus considered his options, then slowly complied. The moment his wrists were beyond the bars, cuffs snapped tight around them. "Marcus Holloway," Keller announced formally, "you're under investigation for the murder of Walter Briggs. You'll be held in administrative segregation pending charges." As the cell door opened, Marcus made eye contact with Edwards. "Remember what you've seen," he said quietly. Edwards nodded once, understanding the request. Be a witness. The journey to the administrative building was tense, the corridors eerily empty due to the lockdown. Marcus walked between the riot guards, Keller leading the procession like a general with a captured enemy. "Smart move with the old man," Keller said, low enough that only Marcus could hear. "Using him to gather information, pass messages. But did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" "You killed a 75-year-old man to send a message," Marcus replied calmly. "That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." Keller's laugh was hollow. "Who I am? I'm the last line between order and chaos in this place. You think you're creating some utopia with your little interracial alliance? You're just setting the stage for a bloodbath. The only blood so far has been shed by you." They reached the administrative wing, passing through several security doors before arriving at the warden's office. Inside, Warden Dunbar sat behind an imposing oak desk, his thin face drawn with tension. Next to him stood a woman in a sharp business suit, Ms. Winters, the prison's legal counsel. "Sir," Keller said, straightening to attention. "Holloway, as ordered." Dunbar nodded, his expression grave. "Remove the restraints, please." Keller hesitated. "Sir, given the seriousness of the accusations—" "The restraints, Sergeant," Dunbar repeated, an edge to his voice. After Keller complied, Dunbar gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, Mr. Holloway." Marcus did so, assessing the room. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile, at least not from Dunbar. Keller remained standing, his posture rigid. "Do you know why you're here?" Dunbar asked. "Sergeant Keller claims I'm responsible for Walter Briggs's death," Marcus replied, evenly. "A convenient accusation considering Briggs was helping me document Keller's corruption." Keller stepped forward. "Sir, Holloway is attempting to—" "I'm aware of what he's attempting," Dunbar cut him off. "What interests me more is the timing of all this. Mr. Briggs is murdered hours before state investigators are scheduled to arrive. A lockdown is initiated, canceling all visitation, including Holloway's meeting with a public defender who has been asking uncomfortable questions about Redwood's operations." Keller's face flushed. "The lockdown was necessary for security." "The lockdown," Dunbar interrupted again, "was implemented without my direct authorization. An unusual breach of protocol, wouldn't you say, Ms. Winters?" The lawyer nodded, her expression neutral. "Very unusual, Warden." Dunbar turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Holloway, I understand you've been collecting information about certain activities within Redwood." Marcus studied the warden carefully. "Yes. And this information, what does it demonstrate exactly?" "A systematic corruption orchestrated by Sergeant Keller, with the complicity of several guards," Marcus said, watching Keller from the corner of his eye. "Contraband operations, selective enforcement of rules based on race, falsified incident reports, unauthorized violence against inmates." "Lies," Keller snapped. "He has no proof." "That's not entirely true," Marcus said, maintaining eye contact with Dunbar. "I have documented evidence, names, dates, specific incidents, all safely stored." "Where?" Dunbar asked. Marcus smiled slightly. "That would depend on who's asking and why." The warden leaned back, fingers steepled. "The state investigation team will be here in approximately 2 hours. They've indicated their primary focus will be allegations of systematic misconduct in D Block, specifically misconduct tied to Sergeant Keller." Keller stepped forward, his composure cracking. "Sir, with respect, these allegations are part of Holloway's attempt to undermine authority. He's been deliberately stoking racial tensions, turning inmates against each other, against the staff. If we don't make an example of him now, we'll lose control entirely." "Is that what happened to Walter Briggs?" Marcus asked quietly. "He was an example?" Keller's head snapped toward him. "You son of a—" "Enough!" Dunbar slapped his palm against the desk. "Sergeant, I need a moment with Ms. Winters and Mr. Holloway. Wait outside." "Sir, I don't think—" "That wasn't a request." Dunbar's tone left no room for argument. After Keller reluctantly left, shutting the door with barely controlled anger, Dunbar turned to Marcus. "Let me be direct, Mr. Holloway. I've been running Redwood for 16 years. In that time, I've maintained a delicate balance, keeping violence to a minimum, preventing riots, ensuring that the public and political officials remain unconcerned about what happens behind these walls. By allowing Keller to terrorize half the prison population," Marcus noted. "By delegating authority to those willing to do what's necessary," Dunbar corrected. "The prison system isn't a social justice seminar, Mr. Holloway. It's about containment, control, and profit," Marcus added. "The kickbacks from Keller's contraband operation, the skimming from the food service budget, the funds diverted from rehabilitation programs, those aren't about control, they're about greed." Dunbar's eyes narrowed. "You seem remarkably well informed." "I pay attention." Marcus leaned forward. "The investigators will too." The warden was silent for a long moment, then turned to Ms. Winters. "Your assessment?" The lawyer sighed. "If even half of what Holloway suggests is documented, we're looking at criminal charges, for Keller certainly, possibly extending higher." "I see." Dunbar drummed his fingers on the desk. "And what would you advise?" "Distance and cooperation," she replied promptly. "If the evidence is as substantial as Holloway claims, Attempting to cover it up would only compound the legal exposure. Dunbar nodded slowly, turning back to Marcus. What exactly do you want, Mr. Holloway? Justice. The warden's laugh was bitter. A concept as malleable as it is elusive. Be specific. Marcus considered his words carefully. Keller removed from his position and charged for Walter Briggs's murder. An end to racial segregation in housing and work assignments. Equal access to educational and rehabilitation programs for all inmates. And no retaliation against those who've stood against Keller's system. Ambitious, Dunbar remarked. And what do we get in return? The evidence focuses solely on Keller and his direct accomplices, Marcus replied. Not on the broader administrative failures that enabled him. Meaning me, Dunbar said bluntly. Meaning the system, Marcus countered. The evidence I've gathered could bring down half the administration, destroy careers, trigger a complete overhaul of Redwood's leadership, or it could target the specific cancer that's been growing unchecked. The warden studied him with new respect. You've thought this through. I've had time. A knock at the door interrupted them. Ms. Winters opened it to reveal a young guard. Not Grayson, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Sir, there's a situation in D Block, he reported. Inmates are refusing to comply with lockdown procedures. They're demanding to know what happened to Holloway. Dunbar frowned. Which inmates? That's just it, sir, the guard replied. It's not just the black inmates. It's nearly everyone. They're standing together. Officers Cooper and Miller tried to use force against the ringleaders, but they were outnumbered. Anyone hurt? Dunbar asked sharply. No, sir. The guards backed down, but the block is effectively under inmate control at this point. Where? Is Sergeant Keller? Headed there now with the tactical team. Dunbar cursed under his breath. Stall them. Tell Keller to wait for my direct order before entering D Block. After the guard left, he turned back to Marcus. It seems your influence extends further than I realized. Not my influence, Marcus corrected. The power of truth. They've seen what Keller's system really is, not protection but exploitation, not order but oppression. Another knock, more urgent this time. Grayson burst in without waiting for permission, his uniform disheveled, his expression desperate. Sir, he gasped. Keller's mobilizing the tactical team against orders. They're preparing to enter D Block with riot gear, CS gas, and full crowd control measures. Damn it, Dunbar muttered. How many? 6 officers, all Keller loyalists. They're saying the inmates are rioting, that immediate suppression is necessary. But they're not rioting, Marcus interjected. They're just standing together. To Keller, that's the same thing, Grayson replied grimly. He's been waiting for an excuse to crack down, eliminate the troublemakers in one sweep. Dunbar stood abruptly. Ms. Winters, notify the state police. Request immediate assistance. Officer Grayson, have all available non-tactical staff form a perimeter around D Block. No one enters without my direct authority. As they moved to comply, Dunbar turned to Marcus. It seems events have forced my hand. But make no mistake, Mr. Holloway. This changes nothing between us. When the dust settles, we'll revisit our conversation. Agreed, Marcus said, rising. But right now, I need to get to D Block. Absolutely not, Dunbar snapped. You'll remain in custody until— With respect, Warden, Marcus interrupted. I'm the only one who might be able to prevent a massacre. Keller's looking for an excuse to use lethal force. If I'm there, if they see I'm unharmed and advocating restraint, it could diffuse the situation. Or it could make you a martyr if things go wrong, Dunbar countered. That's a risk I'm willing to take. The warden studied him for a long moment, then nodded curtly. Officer Grayson will escort you. But understand this. If blood is shed today, it's on your head as much as Keller's. D Block was transformed when Marcus arrived with Grayson. Inmates stood in the common area, cell doors open, some feat of engineering Marcus could only attribute to Big Ray's influence over the trustees who worked in maintenance. White and black inmates mingled freely, their usual divisions temporarily forgotten in the face of a common enemy. At the sight of Marcus, a cheer went up. Listen to me, Marcus. called out, raising his hands for silence. "The state investigators are on their way. The warden has ordered Keller to stand down. But Keller's preparing to come in with force. We need to demonstrate that we're not rioting. We're simply refusing to participate in an unjust system." "They killed Briggs," someone shouted. "They were going to kill you next. And they blamed us for the violence they started," added another voice. Mitchell, standing with several other white inmates who had broken from Skinny Lyle's crew. "Yes," Marcus acknowledged. "The system is corrupt. But we're not going to change. Through violence, that's what Keller wants, an excuse to use lethal force." "So what's the play, Saint?" Big Ray asked, emerging from the crowd. "We just stand here and wait for them to gas us into submission?" Before Marcus could answer, the main door to D Block crashed open. Keller stood in the entrance, tactical team assembled behind him. Black body armor, face shields, weapons at ready. "This is your final warning," Keller called out, his voice amplified by a megaphone. "Return to your cells immediately, or we will use force to restore order." Marcus stepped forward. "Sergeant Keller, the warden has ordered you to stand down. The state police are on their way. The warden doesn't understand the threat," Keller replied, his voice eerily calm. "But I do. I've watched you poison this place, Holloway. Turn order into chaos. That ends today." "The only chaos here is what you've created," Marcus countered, aware of the inmates tensing around him. "Look around you. There's no violence, no destruction, just people standing together against corruption." "Standing together?" Keller laughed harshly. "You've created a powder keg. Black and white inmates united today at each other's throats tomorrow. I'm preventing the inevitable bloodshed." "The only blood shed so far has been by your hand," Marcus called back. "Walter Briggs, the beatings, the arranged incidents to keep everyone divided and afraid." For a moment, something like doubt flickered across Keller's face. Then his expression hardened. "Team, prepare to advance," he ordered. But before they could move, a new voice cut through the tension. "Stand down, Sergeant, now." Warden Dunbar appeared in the doorway, accompanied by state police officers in uniform. "This operation was not authorized," Dunbar continued, his voice carrying authority that made even Keller hesitate. "Your team will stand down and surrender their weapons to the state officers." "Sir," Keller protested, "with respect, you don't understand what Holloway has done. The threat he represents." "What I understand," Dunbar cut him off, "is that one inmate is dead. Another was falsely accused of murder, and you've mobilized tactical response against my direct order." He turned to the state police captain. "Officer Keller is relieved of duty pending investigation. Take his weapon and escort him from the premises." As the state officers moved toward Keller, Marcus saw the moment reality crashed down on him. The realization that his protector had abandoned him, that the system he'd manipulated for years had finally turned against him. Keller's hand moved to his belt, fingers closing around his baton. For a terrible moment, Marcus thought he might go down fighting. Then slowly, he unclipped the weapon and handed it over. "You've made a mistake," Keller said, his eyes finding Marcus across the room. "All of you. This isn't over." "No," Marcus agreed quietly, though Keller couldn't hear him. "But it's a beginning." As Keller was led away, the inmates of D Block remained standing together, witnesses to the fall of a tyrant, and to the first fragile moments of something new being born from the ashes of the old order. But in the crowd, Marcus spotted Skinny, Lyle watching the proceedings with a calculating expression. Keller's removal left a vacuum, one that wouldn't remain empty for long. The hours following Keller's removal passed in a blur of activity. State investigators swarmed Redwood, interviewing inmates and guards, collecting documents, securing evidence. Warden Dunbar, suddenly the model of cooperation, provided office space and full access to prison records, at least those that hadn't mysteriously disappeared in the preceding days. D Block remained under an uneasy truce. The state police maintained a presence, but the tactical team had been disbanded, their equipment secured. Inmates returned to their cells voluntarily, processing the seismic shift in the power structure they had lived under for years. Marcus sat in the common area with Big Ray, watching the investigators work. "Never thought I'd see the day," Ray remarked, nodding toward a state officer interviewing Mitchell and two other former Brotherhood members. White boys testifying against their own. They're not testifying against their own, Marcus corrected. They're testifying against someone who betrayed them. There's a difference. Ray studied him. You really believe that, don't you? That race isn't the defining factor here. I believe it's a tool used to keep us divided, Marcus replied. Easier to control us that way. Before Ray could respond, Officer Grayson approached, his expression somber. They're transferring Keller to county jail, he reported quietly. Charges are pending for Briggs's murder. The state's attorney is building a case. Marcus nodded. And the warden? Claiming full cooperation, disavowing any knowledge of Keller's activities. Grayson's mouth tightened. He'll probably walk away clean unless that evidence you mentioned proves otherwise. Let's focus on one enemy at a time, Marcus said, aware of the many ears around them. What about the other guards, Cooper, Jameson? Suspended pending investigation. Most of the others are keeping their heads down, trying to appear neutral. Grayson hesitated. But there's something else. Skinny Lyle and his core crew are missing. From count. Marcus and Ray exchanged glances. Missing how? Ray asked sharply. They're not in their assigned cells. Not anywhere in D block as far as we can tell. Grayson lowered his voice further. Rumors say they've holed up in the vocational training area. It's mostly deserted since the lockdown, minimal supervision. And plenty of potential weapons, Marcus noted grimly. The vocational training facility housed workshops for carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work, all filled with tools that could become deadly in the wrong hands. Should we tell the state police? Grayson asked. Marcus considered this. Not yet. Let's see what they're planning first. No sense creating a panic if they're just hiding out, waiting to see which way the wind blows. Ray nodded in agreement. I'll put the word out. Any of Lyle's boys try to make a move, we'll know. As Ray moved away to speak with his lieutenants, Grayson studied Marcus with open curiosity. You've done something impossible here, he said quietly. Black and white inmates working together, standing up to the guards, forcing the administration to act. I've been at Redwood for 2 years, and I never thought I'd see anything like it. It's not impossible, Marcus replied. It's just human nature. Push people far enough, they push back. The trick was getting them to push in the same direction. Well, whatever you did, it worked. Grayson straightened, resuming his professional demeanor as a state officer approached. But be careful. Systems like this don't change overnight, and they don't change without a fight. The first tremors of that fight came at dinner. The mess hall, usually segregated by strict unwritten rules, had transformed overnight. Black and white inmates who had stood together against Keller now sat at mixed tables, trading stories, building tentative bridges. The guards watched from the perimeter, visibly unsettled by the new dynamic. Marcus was midway through his meal when Edwards slid onto the bench beside him. Something's happening, Edwards murmured, pretending to focus on his food. Lyle's people are mobilizing, passing messages, gathering supplies. What kind of supplies? Marcus asked. Weapons, medical stuff, food. Edwards glanced around nervously. Word is they're planning to take hostages, force the administration to meet their demands. Which are Keller's reinstatement, your head on a platter, return to the old system. Marcus absorbed this. When? Soon, maybe tonight. Before Marcus could respond, a commotion erupted at the entrance to the mess hall. 3 of Lyle's younger followers had appeared, moving purposefully toward the serving line. The typical Aryan Brotherhood tattoos were visible on their arms and necks, but something was different. Fresh ink, still red around the edges, displaying a new symbol, a stylized letter, K, surrounded by barbed wire. Keller's mark, Edwards whispered. They're making a statement. The 3 men collected their trays, then moved to a table occupied by mixed-race inmates. Without a word, they stood there, staring down at the seated men. You're in our spot, one of them announced finally. A tense silence fell over the mess hall. This was the old pattern reasserting itself. White supremacy, territorial dominance, the implicit threat of violence. The moment hung in balance, a test of whether the new unity would hold or crumble at the first challenge. One of the seated men, Jackson, a black inmate who had been at Redwood for over a decade, looked up calmly. "There are no spots anymore," he said simply. "New system. Sit where you want." The Brotherhood member's face flushed. "Maybe you didn't hear me." "We heard you," interrupted Mitchell, rising from a nearby table. "We just don't care anymore. Your crew doesn't run things now." Other inmates stood in solidarity, white and black together, presenting a united front. The three Brotherhood members glanced at each other, clearly unprepared for this level of resistance. "This isn't over," one muttered as they backed away, taking their trays to an empty table in the corner. "No," Marcus agreed quietly, watching them retreat. "It's just beginning." Later that evening, as inmates returned to D Block for lockdown, Officer Grayson pulled Marcus aside. "We found Lyle," he whispered urgently. "He's set up some kind of command center in the carpentry shop. At least 15 men with him, heavily armed with improvised weapons. They've barricaded the doors." "Have they made any demands?" "Not yet." Grayson glanced around nervously. "But they've been calling in loyal inmates from other blocks. The numbers are growing." "What's the administration doing about it?" "That's the thing," Grayson replied, frustration evident in his voice. "Nothing. Dunbar's worried about optics. Doesn't want to look like he's lost control of the prison, especially with the state investigators still here. He's ordered us to maintain normal operations, pretend everything's fine." "While Lyle builds an army," Marcus concluded grimly. "Exactly." Grayson hesitated. "There's something else. Keller's transport to county never arrived." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Keller's in the wind, and the guard who was driving him, Roberts, is one of his oldest friends." The implications were clear. "You think Keller's coming back, joining forces with Lyle?" "I think it's a possibility we can't ignore." Grayson's expression was grim. "If he does, with the weapons Lyle's gathering, the loyalty they command from certain inmates and guards, it would be a bloodbath," Marcus finished. "You need to be careful," Grayson warned. "If there was ever a time for you to request protective custody, it's now." Marcus shook his head. "I can't hide, not when everything we've built is at stake." As Grayson walked away, Big Ray approached, his expression unusually somber. "My boys just intercepted one of Lyle's messengers," he reported quietly. "It's worse than we thought. They're planning to take over the main administrative building tomorrow morning. Hostages, demands, the whole play. And you're their primary target." Marcus absorbed this. "And Keller?" "Rumor has it he's already back inside. Came through the service tunnels with Roberts's help." Ray's eyes narrowed. "You've got a bullseye on your back, Saint. I can offer protection, but we'd need to move you to a secure location." "No," Marcus decided after a moment's thought. "That's what they want, for me to disappear, go into hiding. It would undermine everything we've accomplished." "Your principles won't stop a shiv between your ribs," Ray countered. "Maybe not. But running would prove Keller right. That fear ultimately controls us all." Marcus met Ray's gaze steadily. "We need to face this head on. Together." Ray studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but we do this my way, with proper security." "Agreed." Word spread through D Block like wildfire. Lyle was mobilizing, Keller had returned, and they were planning to retake the prison, by force. Where such news would once have driven the racial factions apart, now it strengthened their unity. Black inmates who had stood with Marcus against Keller now organized watches, securing entrances to the block. White inmates who had broken from the Brotherhood shared intelligence, identifying potential threats. In the common area, Marcus addressed the gathered men. "What we're facing isn't just about Keller or Lyle," he explained, his voice carrying to every corner. "It's about the system they represent, one that thrives on division, on turning us against each other. They believe that without Keller's iron fist, we'll revert to racial violence, that we need their control. So what's the plan? Mitchell asked from the crowd. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come at us. No, Marcus agreed. We need to demonstrate that we're not the threat. They are. When the state investigators return tomorrow, they need to see that we can maintain order without Keller's brutality. And if Lyle attacks before then, someone else called out. Then we defend ourselves, Big Ray answered, stepping forward. But smart, controlled. We're not starting a war. We're ending one. As the meeting broke up, inmates forming into security teams under Ray's direction, Grayson reappeared at Marcus's side. Dunbar's called an emergency staff meeting, he reported. The state police have been notified about Keller's escape. They're setting up roadblocks, but... He shrugged helplessly. But they're looking outside the prison, not inside. Marcus finished. Exactly. And Dunbar's still refusing to acknowledge the situation with Lyle. Calls it an unconfirmed rumor that would panic the investigators unnecessarily. He's hoping Lyle solves his problem, Marcus realized. Eliminates the witnesses, restores. The old order lets him claim ignorance of the whole thing. That's my read, Grayson agreed grimly. I've been assigned to night duty in C Block, far from here. Convenient, right? Can you get word to the investigators directly? Bypass Dunbar? Grayson hesitated. Maybe, but without concrete evidence of what Lyle's planning, they might just kick it back to the administration. Then we need evidence, Marcus decided, and I think I know how to get it. The plan came together quickly. Edwards, who had worked maintenance before his demotion under Keller, knew the layout of the service tunnels connecting the prison's various buildings. He sketched a rough map, highlighting the route between the vocational area and D Block. This junction here, he indicated a point on the map. It's a blind spot. No cameras, minimal guard presence, especially during shift changes. If Lyle and Keller are planning to move against D Block, they'll come through here. What are you suggesting? Marcus asked. A surveillance operation, Big Ray answered, studying the map. We position men here, gather intelligence on their movements, their numbers, their weapons. Get the evidence Grayson needs. It's risky, Marcus cautioned. If they spot our people, that's why it won't be our people, Ray replied. It'll be me. I know those tunnels from when I was running my own operation. I can move unseen. I can't ask you to take that risk. Ray laughed softly. You're not asking, Saint. I'm telling. This is my house too, and I protect what's mine. The sincerity in his voice moved Marcus. 2 months ago, Ray had been skeptical of everything Marcus represented. Now he was risking his life for their shared vision. All right, Marcus agreed, but you take backup, and at the first sign of trouble you abort. Their planning was interrupted by a commotion at the block entrance. A guard none of them recognized was arguing with the state officer posted there. I need to speak with Holloway, the guard insisted. Warden's orders. The state officer looked dubious. I'll need to verify that. There's no time, the guard pressed. It's about his legal situation, urgent. After a brief radio exchange, the officer reluctantly allowed the guard through. As he approached Marcus, something in his body language triggered a warning. His hand kept straying to his belt, where a baton would normally hang. Holloway, the guard called. Need to speak with you privately. Marcus stood, maintaining distance. Anything you need to say can be said here. The guard's expression tightened. Warden's orders. Confidential legal matter. The warden can come himself if it's that important, Marcus replied calmly. Something shifted in the guard's demeanor, a subtle tensing, a narrowing of focus. His hand moved to his pocket. Actually, he said, his voice dropping, I have a message from Sergeant Keller. The blade appeared as if by magic, a thin, wickedly sharp piece of metal clearly fashioned in the prison workshop. The guard lunged forward, aiming for Marcus's throat with practiced precision. But Ray was faster. His massive arm swung out, catching the guard's wrist in mid-thrust. With a sickening crack, he twisted until the bones gave way. The makeshift knife clattered to the floor as the guard howled in pain. State officers converged on the scene instantly, weapons drawn. The would-be assassin was restrained, cursing as they secured his broken wrist. "Check his ID," Marcus instructed the officers. "I don't think he's regular Redwood staff." A quick search confirmed his suspicion. The man's corrections department ID was expertly forged, good enough to pass casual inspection but not a state database check. "One of Keller's outside contacts," Ray surmised, "brought in to take you out before the real move begins." As the shaken officers radioed for backup, reporting the infiltration and attempted murder, Marcus realized the game had changed. Keller was no longer playing by any rules, not even his own corrupt ones. This was raw survival now. Kill or be killed. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Marcus told Ray once they had privacy. "Your surveillance operation, it needs to happen. Tonight." "Already on it," Ray assured him. "Two of my most trusted men are mapping the tunnel system as we speak. By morning, we'll know exactly what Lyle and Keller are planning." "And then?" Ray's expression was grim but determined. "And then, we end this, once and for all." Outside the block windows, darkness had fallen completely. Somewhere in that darkness, Keller and Lyle were gathering their forces, preparing their counterattack. The old order making its last, desperate stand against the new. The kingdom was in ashes, but from those ashes, something dangerous still stirred. Dawn broke over Redwood with an eerie quiet. The usual morning sounds, guards calling count, doors clanging open, inmates shuffling to breakfast, were replaced by tense silence. D-Block remained on high alert, inmates positioned strategically at entrances and blind spots watching for the attack they knew was coming. Marcus stood by the window, observing the administrative building where state investigators would soon arrive. Beside him, Big Ray looked exhausted but resolute after his night in the tunnels. "They're mobilizing," Ray reported, his voice low. 20 men at least. Makeshift weapons, improvised armor from workshop materials. Keller's running the operation, Lyle providing the muscle. Their plan? Two-pronged attack. Main force comes through the west corridor during breakfast when most inmates are in the mess hall. Secondary team infiltrates through the maintenance access to take the guard station. Ray rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "They've got outside help too. At least 3 guards I recognized, plus some faces I didn't." Timeline? 2 hours, maybe less. They were still organizing when I left. Marcus nodded, processing the information. "And the evidence?" Ray smiled grimly, producing a small digital recorder. "Every word. Their plan, their names, Keller explicitly ordering Lyle to eliminate you and any inmate who sided with you, plus confirmation that Keller orchestrated Briggs's murder." "Grayson should be back on shift soon," Marcus said. "We need to get this to him, have him take it directly to the state police." "Already handled," Ray replied. "My man intercepted him at the gate, passed everything along. State police have been notified. They're mobilizing a tactical response team." Marcus raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," Ray admitted. "Just the things that keep us alive." He glanced toward the gathered inmates. "These men trusted us, followed our lead. I'm not letting them down." Before Marcus could respond, Mitchell approached, his expression tense. "We've got movement," he reported. "C block just went into lockdown. Guards claiming a routine inspection, but none of the regular protocols. They're isolating potential reinforcements," Marcus concluded, "containing the situation block by block." "The question is," Ray added, "do we wait for the attack or take the initiative?" Marcus considered their options. Waiting meant fighting on Keller's terms, likely resulting in significant casualties. Taking the initiative meant risking a confrontation before state police could arrive. "We don't wait," he decided, "but we don't attack either. We evacuate, move everyone to the yard." "The yard?" Mitchell looked confused. "We'd be exposed. Vulnerable." "Exactly," Marcus explained. "In full view of the administrative building, the guard towers, the state investigators. Keller wants bloodshed in contained spaces where he controls the narrative. We deny him that." Ray nodded slowly, understanding dawning. And if he attacks us in the open, he exposes himself completely, Marcus finished. No more shadows. To hide in? It's risky, Ray cautioned. We'd be giving up our defensive position. Sometimes the strongest position is the most exposed one, Marcus replied. Trust me on this. The evacuation began as a routine yard call, inmates filing out of D block in orderly fashion, guards confused but unwilling to interfere with what appeared to be standard procedure. Only when nearly 200 men assembled, in the yard, standing together regardless of race, did the administration realize something unusual was happening. Marcus positioned himself at the center of the group, deliberately visible. If Keller wanted him, he wouldn't have to hunt through cells and corridors. The response came quickly. Warden Dunbar appeared at the administrative building entrance, flanked by security. His face was tight with barely controlled anger as he approached the gathered inmates. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, glaring at Marcus. Why are these men out of their assigned block? We're seeking protection, Warden, Marcus replied calmly. We have credible information that Sergeant Keller has returned to the facility and is planning a violent attack against inmates who testified against him. Absurd, Dunbar scoffed, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Keller is in custody. Is he? Marcus held the warden's gaze. Because we have evidence suggesting otherwise. Evidence that's already in the hands of state police. A flicker of alarm crossed Dunbar's face. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted at the far end of the yard. Guards were streaming from various blocks, converging on the administration building where state investigators had just arrived. It's starting, Ray murmured. The plan became clear as they watched. While attention focused on the unusual gathering in the yard, Keller's loyalists were securing the administration building, cutting off communication, isolating the state investigators, preparing to take hostages. A classic diversion. We need to move, Marcus decided, raising his voice to address the gathered inmates. Stand together, stay visible, head toward the main gate. As the group began to move, guards in the towers grew visibly agitated, unsure whether to treat the orderly procession as a riot. Warning shots were fired into the air, orders to halt broadcast over loudspeakers. Keep moving, Marcus encouraged. Slowly, peacefully. We're not attacking anyone, we're seeking protection. Warden Dunbar, realizing he was losing control of the situation entirely, barked into his radio for reinforcements. But the response was telling. Fragmented, confused reports of guards not at their posts, security protocols failing, communications disrupted. The inmates had nearly reached the main gate when the real attack began. From the vocational building, Skinny Lyle emerged leading his force, a ragtag army of Brotherhood loyalists wielding makeshift weapons, faces contorted with hate and fear. They charged across the yard, aiming directly for Marcus and the gathered inmates. Hold the line, Ray shouted, as the inmates instinctively formed a defensive position. No one breaks ranks. The clash when it came was brutal, but brief. Lyle's men, expecting to fight a disorganized, frightened target, instead met a unified force standing shoulder to shoulder. The numerical advantage was overwhelming, nearly 200 men against Lyle's 20. Marcus watched as the Brotherhood force faltered, several dropping their weapons and backing away when they realized the hopelessness of their position. Only Lyle pressed forward, his face twisted with rage, swinging a length of pipe as he fought his way toward Marcus. This isn't your prison, he screamed, blood spraying from his split lip. It'll never be your prison. Before he could reach Marcus, Ray intercepted him, blocking the pipe with his forearm and delivering a devastating blow to Lyle's sternum. The Brotherhood leader crumpled, gasping for breath as his weapon clattered to the ground. The remaining attackers surrendered or fled, their will to fight evaporating with their leader's fall. But Marcus knew this was only the first phase. The administration building, he called out, pointing to where smoke had begun to rise from our broken windows. That's where Keller is. That's the real target. State police vehicles were streaming through the main gate now, officers in tactical gear deploying rapidly. They moved to secure the yard first, creating a perimeter around the gathered inmates. "We're not the threat," Marcus told the officer in charge, identifying himself. "Keller and his men have taken the administration building. They're holding hostages, including your investigators." The officer's expression hardened as he received confirmation through his radio. "Stay here," he ordered. "All of you. We'll handle this." As the tactical team moved toward the administration building, a lone figure emerged from the smoke, Sergeant Keller, holding a state investigator in front of him as a human shield, a makeshift knife pressed to the man's throat. "That's far enough," Keller called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. "One more step, and he dies." The tactical team halted, weapons trained on Keller but unable to risk the hostage's life. "I want transport out of here," Keller demanded, "for me and my men. And I want Holloway." His eyes found Marcus in the crowd. "This is your doing, Saint, all of it, so you're coming with me." Marcus stepped forward, ignoring Ray's attempt to hold him back. "Let him go, Keller," he called. "It's over. Your men are defeated. The prison is surrounded. There's nowhere to go." "There's always somewhere to go," Keller shot back, pressing the blade tighter against his hostage's throat. "And I'm taking you with me, dead or alive. Your choice." Marcus took another step forward. "No, your choice. Release him and surrender, or kill him and die here, because that's what happens next. You'll be shot where you stand." Keller's laugh was brittle. "You think I care about dying? I lost everything the moment you started spreading your poison in my prison." "It was never your prison," Marcus replied calmly. "That was the illusion. You were just another inmate with a different uniform." Something in Keller's expression shifted, rage giving way to a terrible comprehension. For the first time, Marcus saw real fear in the sergeant's eyes. "It doesn't end with me," Keller said, his voice less certain. "The system doesn't change because one man falls." "No," Marcus agreed, "but it's a start." A shot rang out, sharp and precise. Keller staggered, the knife falling from suddenly nerveless fingers as blood bloomed from his shoulder. The hostage broke free, running toward the police line as tactical. Officers swarmed forward to secure Keller. Marcus watched as they forced the once mighty sergeant to his knees, cuffing his hands behind his back. Their eyes met across the yard, the fallen tyrant and the man who had orchestrated his downfall. "This isn't justice," Keller spat as officers dragged him toward awaiting transport. "This is just a different kind of power. You'll become everything. You fought against Holloway. Mark my words." Marcus didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The aftermath unfolded over days. State authorities took control of Redwood, suspending Warden Dunbar and most of the senior staff pending investigation. Skinny Lyle and his remaining loyalists were transferred to separate facilities, their power structure dismantled. Keller, facing multiple charges including murder, attempted murder, and corruption, was held in protective custody at a state facility. Isolated, alone, just as he had isolated others. In D Block, a fragile new order emerged. The rigid racial segregation that had defined prison life began to dissolve, replaced by associations based on mutual respect and shared interests. Work assignments, educational opportunities, and living conditions were standardized across racial lines. A week after the confrontation in the yard, Marcus found himself summoned to meet with the new interim warden, a stern woman from the State Corrections Department with a reputation for strict adherence to regulations. "Mr. Holloway," she began, formally reviewing his file. "You've created quite a situation here." "I exposed a situation that already existed," Marcus corrected gently. She studied him over her glasses. "The governor's office is taking a personal interest in Redwood now. There's talk of making it a model for reform. Equal treatment regardless of race, improved rehabilitation programs, accountability for staff." "That's good to hear." "It is," she agreed. "But transitions are messy, power vacuums dangerous. I understand you've become something of a leader among the inmates." Marcus chose his words carefully. "I've tried to advocate for justice, for a system that treats everyone with basic dignity." Noble goals, she acknowledged. But here's my concern. You've established yourself as a power broker in a very volatile environment. Some might see that as a threat to proper order. And you? What do you see it as? She set his file aside. An opportunity, potentially. The reforms being considered will need buy-in from the inmate population. They'll need representatives they trust, liaisons between administration and those serving time. Marcus leaned forward. Are you offering me a position? I'm suggesting there might be a constructive role for someone with your influence. She met his gaze directly. Provided that influence is used to support institutional stability, not undermine it. The stability of justice, Marcus clarified, not the stability of oppression. A thin smile crossed her face. We'll need to negotiate those definitions as we go, but yes, in principle. As Marcus left the office, he found Ray waiting in the corridor outside. How'd it go? Ray asked, falling into step beside him. Interesting, Marcus replied. They want to use me to help implement reforms. Smart move on their part. Ray chuckled. Keep your friends close, potential troublemakers closer. The question is, are the reforms real or just window dressing? Ray shrugged. Does it matter? We've got leverage now. Attention from the outside. A unified bloc. We can push for what we need. Marcus nodded, considering this. It's a start, not an end. They walked in silence for a moment, passing through security checkpoints where guards now treated them with wary respect rather than contempt. You know, Ray said finally, when you first arrived I thought you were either crazy or suicidal, standing up to Keller talking about changing the system. And now? Now I think maybe you were right. Ray glanced at the inmates in the yard, no longer segregated by race, no longer living under constant threat of arbitrary violence. One man can't change everything, but he can start something. As they reached D Block, Marcus paused, looking back at the prison complex, the wall still high, the wire still sharp, the fundamental reality of incarceration unchanged. Keller was gone, but the machine of punishment ground on. The work ahead would be long, difficult, with no guarantee of success. What are you thinking about? Ray asked, noticing his expression. Something Keller said at the end. Marcus replied. That I'd become everything I fought against. That this was just a different kind of power. You worried he's right? Marcus considered this carefully. Power itself isn't the problem, it's what you do with it. Whether you use it to oppress or to liberate. And which are you doing? Ask me in a year, Marcus said with a small smile. This is just the beginning. Above them, dark clouds gathered, promising rain. A cleansing, perhaps, or simply the turn of seasons. Either way, change was coming to Redwood State Penitentiary. Not complete, not perfect, but real. A crack in the foundation of a system built on division and fear. And through that crack, a glimpse of something like justice. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.